So welcome everyone, and thank you again for inviting me back. I say back because I was last here on this stage almost exactly 7 years ago at one of the earlier annual conferences. I think it was the third one. And in keeping with the theme of today, past, present, and future, I want to give you a little story of how we've come to be here today. So when we first started 7 years ago, we were pleased to announce our first cybersecurity product to the market, which is a consumer device that allowed you, or a consumer app that allowed you to scan your home network to look for vulnerabilities. As a result of that, and speaking in this very room, we were spotted by the NCSC, who were simultaneously thinking about their code of practice for secure by design, who said to us, hold on, instead of trying to fix the problem once it's in the consumer's household, why don't you try and work with the manufacturers to fix it before it even gets there? And so started our journey over the last 7 years, which has resulted in the launch of our product, SafeShark, that I'm going to talk about, that now does conformance testing for any manufacturer, initially of consumer IoT electronics, but it's widening all the time, to allow them to understand how they fit in with any of the compliance regimes we've talked about so far. I'm not going to go into the detail of those regimes, there's been enough on that today, but I'm going to talk about some of the unexpected findings that we've had over the last 7 years. And actually, I'm going to ask you quite a few questions, which hopefully will stimulate the panel session that will start in a few minutes. So the 5 points I want to raise are the fact that some positives, some negatives, some confusing, or some questions I want to raise. The first good thing is consumer awareness is increasing, and that's amongst the end users of these devices. And in fact, we ran an independent report with one of our partners, the DTG, the Digital Television Group, that found that when asked, 45% of UK consumers are more likely to buy a TV with an official certificate for high security standards over one that doesn't. And that's important because it's giving the consumer choice, and they understand that what they're getting for their money is not just a bigger screen size or more logos, they're actually getting a better, more secure product. The other points I want to talk about are retailers. They're on board. Manufacturers are too, but some of them are taking shortcuts. Installers, as was mentioned before, it's not just about the manufacturers themselves, it's anyone in the supply chain. The manufacturers who sell to distributors or importers, installers who may install equipment, they are all part of that supply chain and need to be involved in that end-to-end compliance. I'm going to talk about some examples where we have a single platform of security across a range of devices, and I'll pose the question of whether that's a good or a bad thing. And finally, I'm talking about how some distributors still don't think it's their problem and how we can address the enforcement of this, because the compliance is only ever as good as the enforcement. And again, hopefully that will raise some questions as well. So the first one, retailers on board. Great. Now, a few UK and EU retailers will now only stock compliant devices. And in fact, we work quite closely with the likes of DSG or John Lewis, and they now have a policy which means they will not stock any devices on their shelves which do not comply with the UK PSTI regulations. And this is encouraging because then is encouraging or even forcing some manufacturers to start adopting these standards. And obviously that's a positive thing. However, the flip side is we've now found that some manufacturers are taking shortcuts and creating fraudulent compliance certificates. Now, how do we know this? Well, it's because one of the retailers we work with phoned us up and said, did you really write this statement of conformity? And we said, we don't think so. And it turns out one of the manufacturers had been taking one we had given them for a different product, literally photocopying it, but changing the device on it and passing it off as a tested device with our logo on it. Now, clearly that's subverting the whole process because that device has not been tested, definitely not by us. And I'd like to pose the question of how we manage to regulate that and who's liable for that and how do we make sure that we're not duping the end user into thinking something has been tested when it hasn't been. Maybe a question for later. So how do we check that devices are legitimate? And one thing I'll throw in that I do think might be quite a useful talking point is, could there be an online repository or a registry of devices that can be looked up by manufacturers to see, did this device really go through some kind of test procedure or compliance? And the second one I wanted to talk about was the single platform. Is this a good or a bad thing? It comes back to our my title of my talk, is some manufacturers are using a single software stack across a range of devices. It's very clear that a lot of manufacturers now have ecosystems of smart devices. I went to the European Consumer Electronics Show, IFA, in Berlin, And it's staggering the number of devices that want to work together. So you buy a television, it talks to your washing machine and your tumble dryer and your toaster and everything else as part of one connected world. And one way they're making their lives simpler is by having a single software stack across their product range. This meant that when we were looking at or doing one of our tests on a TV device, we found this code that I put up on the screen. I'm not going to name who it came from, but clearly this is a manufacturer that creates both TVs and refrigerators, because inside the TV, there's code for whether there's a refrigerator door is open, whether there's a water leak, what the light sensor is doing, and so on. Now, the two questions here is, well, one is that might make a lot of sense, because you only have one software stack across all devices. But it also means that one vulnerability can now attack your attack surfaces every single device you have, not just one single area. It also means that now the firmware updates for these devices are now in excess of a gigabyte for a firmware update, which I think is quite excessive for a consumer device. That's a lot of lines of code to make sure are absolutely compliant. So there's an argument to say, keep it simple, only have as much as you need in the device you're using, and not have a single software across all your devices. And whether they can, some manufacturers are then saying, well, hold on, we only need to test the software stack once, whether it's a fridge or a TV, and it should cover all devices. I've mentioned that point. The other point I want to make is the fact that if installers are on board, some of the distributors are not. We've been working closely with an organization called CEDIA, who have a worldwide membership of professional AV installers. So they make podcasts available for their members, and we've been involved in helping them promote the story around compliance and regulation to their installers who put smart home equipment into end users' homes. However, some of the distributors still do not feel it's their responsibility to check the manufacturers for compliance. And we see this as quite a big issue, because some of these AV devices are being installed into people's homes, but within the fabric of the homes. They're part of a lighting system or smart blinds or shower system, and are actually inside the walls. And if you'll indulge me, I've got enough time, yes, I'm going to play a 30-second clip from one of my favorite TV series recently called Mr. Robot, you might have seen. And if you have sound, and it plays.
But what am I supposed to do? I mean, nothing is working. Unplug what? Everything is inside the walls. That's how it was installed when I ordered the Smart House package.
Everything's inside the walls. That's how it was installed when I ordered my smart home package. This is going to become more and more prevalent because houses are now being sold with these systems inside. We need to make sure that the systems that are baked into the homes are able to be updated, or at least understood what they can and can't do from a security perspective. So briefly to wrap up in the last 30 seconds, how we do this though, SafeShark, what's our reason for being? Well, as I said before, we work by doing cyber security testing. Like has been said before, we will never say that you're 100% secure, but what we can say is you're 100% compliant. So we work very closely with some of the standards we've mentioned already, PSTI, RED, and moving forward, CRA as well, so that we can do as many automated tests as we possibly can on these devices. That means that we can be very objective in the way that we do these tests, and we can continually monitor them. It means that if devices change over time with firmware updates, we can spot the changes, and if they suddenly put a device out of spec that was within spec before. And it allows us to also support the product lifecycle and ensure the robustness of the certification. And it won't surprise you to know we've been working with some of the largest manufacturers on the planet, like LG, Panasonic, Hisense, and others, to test anything from smart TVs to showers. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll gladly answer any questions in the panel session in the next bit. Thank you.